So, this happened when I was 12 years old. During the summer of my seventh grade year, me and my family decided to take a trip up to Alabama to visit my grandfather's estate. My grandfather had just recently passed away due to a massive heart attack, so unsurprisingly, my family was very distraught. My mother was will executor, so she was in charge of the estate and taking inventory of all of my grandfather's belongings. As we pull up to the house, I get an eerie feeling. To give you a little perspective on the setting, I will describe the house. The house is located in a white trash neighborhood filled with druggies and weirdos. A couple of years after the visit, the house would be broken into and the copper from the wiring in the house would be stolen. So that gives you kind of an idea of the scumbags my grandfather had living around him. The house itself kind of looked like the house from the Amityville horror movie. It was 2 stories with a basement. It had 3 bedroom and 2 bath on the top floors, and 1 bedroom and 1 bath in the basement. It had wood floors, and the ceiling was unpainted. The only place in the house where the ceilings were somewhat painted was in my grandparents' bedroom. It had an X pattern in a sequence of patterns across the ceiling. The bedroom was particularly big and had a bathroom in it. It is also the room my grandfather died in. My grandfather was 6'7" and 300 pounds, so I'd guess that was what had attributed to his heart attack. The house exterior was made of wood and sat on 10 acres of land, another 100 acres if you count the land that was leased. The land was littered with old rusty cars that my grandfather used to collect parts off of. The inside of the house was rustic and the furniture looked like it was bought from a Goodwill. It smelled musty, a smell that I can't really associate with too many other things. Just to be clear, I'm not knocking the house. My grandfather built the house with his bare hands, so I had a lot of respect for it. He and my grandmother had spent the first 3 years building the house and living in the basement. The basement smelled even worse than the upstairs. It smelled like old, dead air. The kind of smell you would smell at an abandoned house in the middle of the woods. It had a kitchen and a living area and a bedroom. I like to spend a lot of time down there, snooping through the wide variety of items my grandfather had. From old radios to old police monitors, my grandfather had everything down there. On one particular day, my parents were outside taking inventory of the vast collection of mechanic parts, and I was snooping around in the basement. As I was down there, I started to hear a noise above my head. It sounded like footsteps coming from my grandparents' bedroom. I figured it was one of my parents in there to get something. I shrugged it off and continued with my snooping. The sound never went away though. It started out soft and gradually got louder, and then starting all over again. It sounded as if it were walking back and forth. I decided to go up and investigate the noise, but no one was up there. I was creeped out to say the least, so I joined my parents outside where I stayed for the rest of the day. Fast forward to that night. I was forced to sleep in my grandparents' bedroom despite my protest. Luckily, I was sharing the room and the bed with my grandmother, who happened to join my parents on the trip. My parents would sleep across the hall, and me and my mom got into some sort of argument, and I was forced to go to bed early. I was in this creepy bedroom alone, while my grandmother was right outside the bedroom in the living room. She was watching TV. Despite the noise coming from the TV outside, the bedroom was extremely quiet. The bed faces the door going out to the living room, and the bathroom door sat on the right side of the bed. So here I was, in this creepy bedroom, laying on my back in bed. As I was laying there, I began to think about the footsteps I had heard earlier. I didn't like it in that bedroom. The air inside that room seemed suffocating. As I was laying in bed, I heard noises inside the bathroom. I laid there motionless with my head turned towards the door. My eyes were locked on that closed door. This bathroom wasn't big at all. It was like the size of a storage closet. I will never forget the noise that I was hearing from that bathroom, though. It sounded like a gargling sound. It sounded like a choking, gargling sound. I really can't explain how scared I was. I just laid there, paralyzed with fear. Several seconds went by, although it felt like hours, before the sound quit. It fell silent again, even more silent than before. I was still too scared to move. I wanted to scream out to my grandma, but I couldn't bring myself to do so. I rolled over on my side so I could permanently keep my eyes on the door. A few minutes went by before I started to notice something again. The door handle on the door was slowly moving from one side to the other, as if someone were trying to open it but couldn't bring themselves to do so. I stared in complete horror. My mouth was hanging wide open. The door began to creep open. It was an inward swinging wood framed door, so it would be opening away from me. As the door began to open, all I could think was that I had to get out of there, but I couldn't bring myself to do so. I couldn't move. The door opened about halfway before it stopped abruptly. It was dark in the room, but the TV from the living room outside illuminated the room a little bit. I could see a dark shadow moving around in the bathroom. I couldn't quite make out the shape of it. It looked eternally dark, sort of like a black hole of darkness. All of a sudden, a face popped out of that darkness. I was horrified. It was my deceased grandmother. Her head and face were showing, but not her body. It was almost as if she was peeking out at me. I was even more weirded out by how close to the floor the head was. It was about an inch underneath the door jamb. Her long gray hair hung to the side of her thick glasses, just about covered her whole face. Words can't even begin to describe how terrified I was. I contemplated getting out of bed and running out of the room, but the thought of my grandmother reaching out, grabbing my legs, and pulling me to my doom, I quickly pushed this thought out of my mind. So I just laid there, stared at her. She stared back at me. She began to smile. Oh God, that smile. That smile, that wasn't my grandmother. I don't know who or what that thing was, but it wasn't my grandmother. The smile had dry, caked on blood surrounding it. It was pure evil. The head began to move its way up, past the door jamb until it finally stopped at the top of the door, which had to be 7 feet high, its eyes never leaving mine. It began to creep its way from the side all the way to the middle of the doorway, its dark body just about covering the entire door. I couldn't stand it any longer. I closed my eyes and screamed louder than I had ever screamed before, over and over and over again. Finally, my dad burst through the door, followed by my mother and grandmother. A wave of panic filled their faces as they flicked on the light and looked at my face. I was pale white and staring into space. They began questioning as to what was wrong, but I couldn't say anything. Eventually, they calmed me down enough where I could finally tell them what happened. They first looked at each other and then back at me. I could tell that they were skeptical but scared at the same time. My father went and checked out the bathroom. Of course, there was nothing in it. My mother finally moved me out of the room and into a different bedroom on the other side of the house. I never heard anything else about this incident from my parents. I'm not even sure if they believed me. All I know is that writing about this 10 years later, it still gives me the creeps and sends chills down my spine. Probably because one of the disturbing facts that I learned a couple years after the incident, when the house was finally sold, my grandmother didn't just die. She committed suicide in that very bathroom. A gunshot to the chest. I was very close to my grandmother, so I know that she wouldn't do anything to scare me like that. So whatever that thing was, I hope I never see it again. After learning of my grandmother's suicide and that demon I met in her bedroom, I eventually came to a revelation. I believe my grandfather had an unseen factor that contributed to his heart attack. That monster that I encountered in the bedroom, it was the culprit that had gone unnoticed and ultimately led to my grandfather's demise. Hey guys, hope you enjoyed the video. I'd originally planned on this channel being scary stories as well as movies and TV show discussions, but those are very different subjects, so I decided to make a second channel for that sort of thing. So if you're into that, I will leave a link in the description below. I'm really enjoying making these videos, and I hope you guys enjoy hearing them. And if you do, definitely like, subscribe, and share it, guys. Thanks again, and have a good one.